Well, hello, Ali. It's lovely to see you, albeit on the screen. And I just want to begin our conversation by acknowledging that you there in the Flinders University Museum of Art and me at home, we meet on the beautiful Ghana country. And I just want to acknowledge the privilege of that and pay our respects to Ghana elders past, present and emerging. So it's a real privilege as well to introduce you, Dr. Ali Gumillya Baker, a Mirning woman from the west coast of South Australia. Ali is an academic, a visual artist, a performer, a filmmaker, and she is a colleague as a lecturer in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Flinders University. Ali is also, very significantly, a member of the Unbound Collective, which is made up of 4 Aboriginal artists, activists and academics who are all based at Flinders. And I have to say, Ali, that as a colleague of yours, the Unbound Collective brings something incredibly special to the environment of research and teaching that we share at Flinders. Now, we're having this conversation today. It's being hosted by the University Museum of Art at Flinders, and it is being held to mark the 250 years since James Cook's landing on Dharawal Country on the 29th of April in 1770. It also anticipates an exhibition that you, Ali, are curating with the director of the Art Museum, Fiona Salmon, that begins in about a month. And this exhibition is called In the Hold, and it interrogates and challenges the traditions of memorialising and celebrating Cook's landing in Australia. And it does this through contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, including your own. And I believe that exhibition, In the Hold, will feature the work, or one of the works that we're especially interested in today, which is your work, Sovereign Fleet, which is part of, I believe, the Tall Ships project. And this is one of the images from Sovereign Fleet. And this features the performer Faye Roses Blanche, who is part of the Unbound Collective. And the other works, which we'll look at in a moment, feature Simone Yulal-Couture and Alexis West as well. Ali, I wonder, just thinking about the 250 years and the bringing of the model ships together with the images of Faye and Simone and Alexis, if you could tell me a little bit about the title of this work. I'm particularly interested in the term sovereign and how you're using it here in this context.
Hi, Kath. Thanks so much. So this work I started making in 2013, and we performed. So I made the ship hats actually in 2012, and I performed at Tandanya in an exhibition with the late Ian Wilding. And I was really interested in, at that time in 2012, this, it was during the Tony Abbott administration. He was the Prime Minister, and there was a lot of conversation around this idea of sovereign borders, and there was a lot of conversation around boats, and I guess the impact of how elections were being won on the ideas of stopping the boats, and also on the kind of treatment of people who were arriving on boats, and the kind of devastating impact of a boat that got washed up onto the shores of Christmas Island. And I guess the kinds of narratives around particular ideas of borders, and also this idea of sovereignty, which as an Aboriginal person growing up in the Aboriginal community in Adelaide, with very, political extended family and community, I guess I was really interested in responding to this idea of a sovereign fleet and what that might look like. And around that time, I'd been obsessed with kind of looking at imagery that represented the colonial kind of representational occupation. So how ideas of colonisation and invasion and settler colonialism had kind of its foundations in particular kinds of colonial representations of tall ships. I was interested in kind of shipwrecks, tall shipwrecks, and I'd become a little bit kind of obsessed with these ideas of lucky and unlucky country, and this, and it all was having a focus with a kind of an election that was won on that idea of people throwing their children overboard, which was proven to be not true. This kind of particular kind of myth making and media beat ups and representational kind of hijacking of people, and how we could. So Aboriginal people are often used in kind of election campaigns as a kind of a point of fear. So we looked at like the Northern Territory intervention, and so the emergency response. Also from around that time, and a particular kind of ways in which the media used all of those sets of ideas, the unspoken underbelly, really, of what was going on in community to harness particular kind of fear-based and reactionary responses. So we made these works, and I wanted to be like a sovereign fleet, and we handed out little poems as we would sail through a space in formation. And I'd made these, so I'd found all these model ships at the secondhand shop, and then I made hats out of fly wire and dresses out of paper. And we were considering, I guess there was also kind of, you know, if you look at famous milliners, there's a history of around the time of colonisation of Australia where white women would wear ship hats in as part of a kind of allegiance showing to warring nation states. So there's actually a history of these kinds of hats in Europe. So for me, it had, and also because we're at Flinders University, Kath, we both work here, and our obviously our university is named after a non-Indigenous explorer, and our logo is a tall ship. And I'd had numerous conversations with the marketing at Flinders about how difficult making this university a university of choice for Aboriginal people when we had a colonising tall ship as our logo. So it's kind of, you know, what would how could we respond in an image? And so these profiles, and they also speak to, I guess, the history of silhouette work that's being done. You see some carved wax silhouettes that are in the South Australian Art Gallery in their colonial wing. You'll see, so yeah, there's a whole range of convergence of those particular, and then also there's this incredible artist, creative performers who I'm surrounded by, who I'm in total awe of, and who are incredibly beautiful. And I just don't see enough representations of Aboriginal women and the incredible beauty of our community. And I just wanted to showcase, in particular, these three women who are, in their own right, like incredible performers. And so it's their sovereignty that they're performing in the, like they bring that to this work. And Alexis is a playwright, a filmmaker and a performer. Simone is our current Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous and has performed all over the country and comes from a long line of songwomen. And I've known Simone and Faye for 20 years now, and there's an incredible gift of knowledge and love and performance and song that they bring to teaching. So we were considering all of those things as well when we did our performances in these hats, when we made some films using the hats as well. And then these images, these photographs were made at that time as well.
What an incredibly rich and layered work it is, Ali. I mean, I already thought that before you put it in the context of the Abbott years and the politics of asylum seeking and all of those other things. So, and you mentioned a couple of times the performances of these wonderful women, and here I believe we have Simone.
No, that's
is that right?
That's
Sorry.
Alexis.
Oh, it's Alexis. Okay. I wonder if you can say a little bit about the context of this particular image, and also, how you see the role of performance in the work of the Unbound Collective, because I know you have travelled with your performances, and I've been lucky enough to be present for some of those performances, and my understanding is that performance is very central to the work that you do as artists. So could you speak a little bit about that, Ali?
Sure. So I've always loved performance. So when I was at art school, I was in a performance group called Chimney Shop, and so we performed a lot. And the late Linda Lou, I made some of this work because I hadn't performed for a long time, and I guess there's something about, the ephemeral nature of performance that can't, like you have to be there. It's momentary and it's a gift of our bodies in space at a particular time. And it's incredibly beautiful and can be really powerful and moving. But I guess we're interested in kind of thinking about the embodied sovereignty, and particularly performing that in kind of response to a kind of a concrete or fixed and fixed archive. So how do we speak back to those ideas of fixing and measuring and containing and collecting with performance? And I think performance does that. So this was at the opening of Historia, which was at the Adelaide Town Hall, and it was curated by Carolyn Kavanagh. And I had 3 photographs in that show of the 3 tall ship and Sovereign Fleet, of the Sovereign Fleet. And we, Carolyn asked if we would perform. And so for this performance, I didn't actually perform. I directed and made the costumes and kind of arranged it. So Alexis, Faye and Simone performed on the marble steps of the town hall, and Simone sang a song by the late Lily Sainsbury called For I, Aborigine, which is an incredibly powerful and moving song. So she stood at the top of the stairs and sang this song, which, the lines, and I never wanted to be like you, I never wanted to do as you do. And then they handed out little slips of paper that had Racial Discrimination Act. And it was also around the time that there'd been a whole lot of kind of wanting to shift I think what was his name? The guy who wanted the attorney, not the attorney general. Is it Brandis? He wanted to change the Racial Discrimination Act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we were really kind of against the changing of that, simply because it's a really important protection, even though sometimes it doesn't work, but it does actually highlight, for some laws like the intervention, they had to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act in order to put the law in, and it requires people to actually consider the racialised bodies of Aboriginal people. So, I don't know, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, Kath. I'm just wondering if
No, the context is always really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I suppose, you know, that gives us a sense of perhaps the kinds of, you know, subject positions that people in the audience might have had in, you know, as they're responding to the performance at the time.
Yeah. Oh, they were also wrapped around lollies. So for this one,
right.
We had the slips of paper wrapped around like a molasses lolly, and that was a reference to, like, for Simone's mum's communities, when the missionaries came, they would throw lollies out to the children. And it's kind of like, you know, so there's a painting actually in the art museum by Kunyi Makineni, which is of this kind of lolly giving
okay.
thing. So sorry,
Yeah,
my screen's just gone black, so I'm just gonna. Oh, here we go. I'm back on.
Okay. Ali, when you were talking at the beginning about the performance, I was thinking about Ross Gibson's idea of palpable history, and I suppose as a history teacher, you know, I have found it really useful to be able to get students to be with artworks and to observe performances by Aboriginal people, as you know, performances that are speaking to the way we think about the past and its role in the present. And I wonder, I suppose, you know, the idea that we can have ways of conveying history and its dynamic relationship with the present that isn't about, as you say, contained texts and archives, but that sort of opens things up to a different sort of response. It might be a particularly powerful way of conveying those messages because it's embodied. And I was thinking how funny it is to be talking about all of this in the context of COVID-19 when we're forced to speak across the internet rather than actually be in each other's physical presence, which is a bit of a loss, but thank goodness we have a way of doing it. But I do think that, yeah, the sort of embodied experience of being present for a performance is very different from reading an account in a text or you know, being in the archive or anything like that.
You can bring an emotional resonance to performance, and particularly, you know, like performance and song, bodies together in rooms. You can look people in the eye. You can move and shift and change with your audience. And I mean, it's also free on so many levels. It's a street performance, or like it's ceremonial. So, you know, knowledge changes in relationality. So for Aboriginal ways of understanding, you're on country, it's about the light in the sky and the relationship of the collective. Who's there, who's present, and whose stories are we sharing? And how are those stories being shared, and whose voices are there? And it's our bodies together, and it's the smells and all of the kinds of the physicality of sensory. Yeah. And I think that does an incredible job of kind of helping us to consider that. I mean, I read the 7 versions of An Australian Badland, and it on so many levels speaks to that layering of this sense. Or he talks about kind of traces of what's left in the present. So I remember listening to him talking about midden heaps of kind of knowledge of like the debris, the discarded nature of kind of the world around us. So what is left behind? What's the debris of the present? And, you know, some of the work is about that. It's about what's discarded in the op shops. So, you know, like those model tall ships, that kind of nationalism is not as fashionable, maybe. And so, but it's nevertheless, it is our history. You know, it's part of our history. It's not the entire version of a history, but it speaks to a particular kind of nationalism that has allowed for the oppression of Aboriginal people.
Yeah. And so, they're very familiar as well, those objects. You know, they're not strange to us.
Right. And so you can read them, like they're, you know, in a sense, everyone can read a tall ship as a visual symbol. It's kind of like visual kind of literacy. There's things that jump out and they speak to us really strongly, and there's a whole range of kind of associations that we might have with that. But when you peel back those layers, what you have is some really important and really interesting entanglements of history. And for me, that is what is important to know about community. That it is complex, it's not polarised, but also that Aboriginal people are forced to bear the weight of a lot of the darkness of that, and how we might share that weight-bearing activity of history, of knowing kind of particularly dark understandings about our history. If we can create, if we can have creative responses to it, it allows us to shed some of the it's almost like people just want to switch off because it's almost unbearable. Like some of that history is so unbearable to read. But if you kind of shift your representational relationship to it, you can look it in the eye and embody it in ways that could be healthy, not make you sick or something. I don't know. You know, it's not amnesia. It's kind of like, but it's also allowing for people to have a rest, because I just feel I'm really conscious, I guess, in teaching. You know, we teach Indigenous and non-Indigenous students at Flinders, but mainly non-Indigenous students about what I teach about Aboriginal history. So I have to be kind of constantly thinking about the ways in which people are allowed into these stories and how they feel personally connected, because I do think it's the emotional relationship that you have with something that will allow you to retain it and for it to change you in some way. So, I think that's the art, you know, the possibilities of kind of creative work is important in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of our non-Indigenous students, that creative work is from Aboriginal artists is a kind of act of generosity that enables them to access more truthfully their own past and their heritage in relation to this history. I just want to, I was going to ask you briefly about the colours in this, Ali. Do you want to say something quickly about that? And then I'd like to ask you about the film component of tall ships as well, which is our next slide.
So it's Sovereign Fleet, and it's black, yellow and red, or red, yellow and black. But it's our colours. It's the Aboriginal flag, the colours of the Aboriginal flag. And I guess it's I just wanted, you know, like I remember a late auntie our power, saying at a march when I was young, you know, you've always got to get out there and you've got to wear your colours. And we've done a lot of marching, you know, I've done a lot of kind of marching and protests and demonstration, and you make yourself visible and you put yourself out there and you put your body on the line and wear the colours. And like Aboriginal people, you know, like I'm a fair-skinned Aboriginal person, but you know, like when it's a political act. Our bodies are not loved in, you know, like when we went to Sydney in 1988, our bodies weren't loved in relation to the kind of 1988 celebration of the bicentenary. And that's to the detriment, you know, of the bigger story of this nation. You know, we're incredibly beautiful here. And we're not going anywhere. There's nowhere else to go.
That's right.
We can't leave anyway now. All the sovereign borders have been shut.
That's right. And these are just stunning images, these three women.
We move across our land, yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And this, now am I right, Ali, that this was taken at Fontenelle Gallery in Bowden when the exhibition was there, or not?
So these are video loops. And those videos were made at our friend's house in a chook. The yoga studio was attached to a chook yard, and I had made this screen out of pieces of tissue, again really poor, like I didn't have any money to kind of, so I'd made, you can see all the parts where the tissue is stuck together, and I was really interested in the work, particularly of Cara Walker, who's an African-American, incredible, makes huge kind of dioramas of silhouettes, cutouts. And her work really speaks to these kinds of understandings of huge grand narratives of history and then specific moments of violence, and really requires you to ask the question of, you know, in that grand narrative of history, you know, millions of slaves or thousands of people were killed, or there was a huge colonial movement. In that kind of big story, the individual acts that can occur where you are required to think about the humanity of what has just happened. Artworks bring that into a sharp focus. So they really ask you a question about what was happening here and so her work is, you know, some of the most violent and appalling acts of genocide that could have happened in relation to these ideas of race. And they look kind of beautiful because they're silhouettes, so you can't really make out what's happening. And then you make it out. You go, oh, wow, that's incredibly grotesque. So it's kind of that capacity to kind of bring people in, and it's beautiful, and then it's not beautiful, and then you kind of go, okay, well, what is it? I was interested in that, the way shadows do that, how shadows are, you know, are traces. They're kind of not the full thing. Yeah. And they speak to a whole kind of other history of visual narrative. And so this work, we projected from the back some rolling seas, and then had made these works which are kind of like reenacting the reenactment. So I was kind of like talking about how, you know, in 1988, they made these replica tall ships, and then they sailed from England and did a reenactment of and they'd done a reenactment before. So there's like reenactments of reenactments of reenactments, which speaks to kind of modernity in a way.
Yeah.
And this, so it's us reenacting them, reenacting themselves. And so, and then we just start to get quite hysterical in that. And so where the actual is silent, the films are silent, but if you actually heard the soundtrack, just us laughing, because I'd gotten to the point where I had been reading so many of the racist texts, and I think we'll get to them, and looking at the extent of the racist kind of descriptions of Aboriginal people that we were kind of really interested in the construction of the civilised arriving to save the heathen savages or the primitive others, And so, but then the ships were falling off, so there was like a shipwreck, and then we're like, oh, it's great. And then we had rope, and then we did another one, which was kind of, which had been bought by the Australian Centre for Moving Image, which is called Colonial Imagination Down Among the Wild Men, which is me in a ship hat pretending to write back to the mother country with a big feather quill, and then Bonner with a large kind of fork stabbing me in the back, and then pretending to eat me, like this idea of kind of cannibalism as being like the epitome of savage, and then so that's like the polarization of images and the construction of how you create savagery, how you create civilized, how you create a colonial outpost. So
does that speak to?
Yeah, that's it there.
This?
That's the one. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the one. And that's been bought by the Australian Centre for Moving Image in Federation Square. So that's in their new exhibit.
Fantastic.
Okay, and I'd found this book, Down Among the Wild Men, which is actually about Faye's kind of country. It's about the little people of the Atherton Tablelands, and this kind of it's like the epitome of an anthropological racialized text about, and it was in the racist text. So these are
okay. So that's what this is here.
They're all connected in that way. So we were kind of like progressing along this story of making responses. Yeah.
It's such a wonderful body of work, especially now I hear you make all of these connections. There are so many of them. And this is currently on display at the Flinders University Art Museum.
Yeah, and just a 3-metre version. This is 8 metres, and was at the Australian Centre for Australian Centre for Contemporary Art at ACCA.
Right.
Yes. And it was part of a big exhibition called Unfinished Business: Perspectives on Art and Feminism. And they've got an 8-point-something-metre high wall in ACCA.
Brilliant.
So I was like, I can reach the ceiling. It's like you could reach the ceiling and you can keep going. It's basically one of those things.
Yeah.
The never-ending stream, but you can kind of get the parameters of it. Like there's a kind of, like I would read things and I would say it was breathtakingly racist and disgusting in the way that the descriptions would unfold, and then you'd think, oh, that has to be the most racist thing I've ever read, and then I'd find something else and I'd go, oh no, that's and so then I was really thinking about the atmosphere that's created by that knowledge. So growing up on the periphery of Adelaide in Salisbury, at a time before the internet when books were your only way of finding out about ideas, or you could go and look in microfiche kind of database things, and look through old newspapers on slide film, and the internet had just started to come in when I was at uni, but no one really had a computer. I was writing my essays by hand. So I think about the importance of books in my life. And, you know, and then for my mum, she grew up in Port Adelaide at a time when they didn't have any books. Books were really expensive. You didn't have any books. She joined the church because they gave you a free book.
Wow.
And I was thinking about, like, the atmosphere, like the fact that she couldn't go to a library and find anything written about who we are as Meaning people living on Ghana country. The only things that she would have been able to find written about us as Aboriginal people were racist descriptions of who we are, or a complete absenting of our bodies in the text. So it was like a Aileen Morton Robinson calls it a terranologing us.
Brilliant. Yeah.
You know, it is, and it is. It's complete terranologous kind of. It's a way of. It's a way of kind of representing a genocidal act by completely excluding people from text. So you have these kinds of the way that they made it into the stack was so it's completely my opinion. I had to get legal advice because seriously, I have living authors in there, but I actually put them facing the wall so that they wouldn't.
Right. Was that the legal advice? Don't show the spine.
No, it was just because I didn't, like, I wanted to know that they were in there, but I didn't care that they knew. It wasn't about, you know what I mean? Like, they can imagine that they're in there. You know, like there were a lot of kind of texts in there, but it was just my opinion. So I'd gotten legal advice, and you're allowed to, you know, that's what the Liberals defend, isn't it? You know, like this idea of being allowed to insult or allowed to, you know, free speech. Ultimately, me, I've decided that that was a racist text for their particular reasons, and they were the reasons. Either had a racist description, and that was from my opinion in the current context. So at that time, they might have not considered that language to be racist, but for me, reading it, it was racist. And so I would just put it in. And I felt really like it changed the relationship that I had with those texts. They didn't have the same. Like, it changed my relationship with the university. It kind of changed me collecting that and thinking about the importance of books. I mean, you know, Kath, because we work at a university, there's a great amount of emphasis put on getting research quantum for writing books and articles and the actual, you know, and sometimes some of the stuff that I've read, it's just writing for writing's sake. You know, like it's not actually, I sometimes think, well, and how does it reach outside of the academy? And I guess our work with the Unbound Collective was thinking about how we, if our communities aren't coming in to the university, how do we engage with our communities outside of space? And not just Aboriginal communities. And I guess, you know, visual arts is one way of doing that allows you the freedom to say whatever you want to say. And there's this kind of space there. You don't have to be didactic. You don't have to scaffold someone into that. You can just, people will come to it as they find it and have their own way of relating to that, or they won't. But I found that was a kind of also a way that we collectively wanted to reinsert ourselves into the archive. So it was a kind of looking back, but it was also a reinsertion.
And a construction of an archive itself, really, in a way. This is an archive of racist texts.
Yeah. And I thought the ultimate great thing would be if I could get it bought.
Yeah.
Like I was imagining, imagine if I got this, like these racist texts then had to be archived as racist texts, like, but it hasn't happened. I mean, it's a pretty risque kind of work. I don't know. I loved it that Akka wanted it, and it still fills me with such, like, hysterically, like, I'm still so amazed at some of them. Like, they're really amazing.
Yeah. And am I right, Ali, that they are, academic texts, scientific texts, but children's books, a whole range of genres?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The colonial book of, bedside book of colonial doings, Australia, like wild land, dark land, it goes through, it's kind of tourist texts, national institutional texts. I've even got the Constitution in there. Books on law, academic anthropological texts, books of, tombs of Australian history that I can just, and even Australian art, that totally excludes Aboriginal people. Like it's the whole construction of Australia that excludes Aboriginal people is called, for me, is like, I just called it out. And so that was great. It was because most of those texts were discarded. They'd been discarded from the libraries. They'd been discarded into the second-hand shops. And you can just find them in there. No one wants them. No one wants them on their shelves. No one wants to borrow them from the library. So that says something else as well about our relationship.
Yes. And to destroy them would have a very different kind of effect than what you've done here, which I think is really important.
No, I don't want to destroy them.
No, that's right.
Like I said, because what was happening in the libraries at that time also was that offensive and racist texts were being moved into special collections, so you couldn't happen upon them.
You had to seek them out.
Through the library. Because the best part for me about going to the library is not what I've gone there for, but what I haven't gone there for and what I just happened to see while browsing the shelves. They're the interesting things, because you don't know what's in there. You don't know what you don't know.
That's right.
And I said, the opportunity for us to happen upon our own histories is becoming limited because of the protection against offence, so the librarians don't want people to be upset. I can understand the reasons why, but at the same time, this is our very recent history, and most of the world is offensive to Aboriginal people in some kind of level. Like it can be difficult to kind of negotiate that, but so that they were all the kinds of other questions and conversations that have been happening around how we memorialise our history, how we remember, how we forget. And forgetting is a really important function of being alive. Well, if you don't forget, you go mad. And so it's thinking about us being allowed to forget, because if I refuse to forget the things that have happened to our peoples unless they are remembered, so if there can be some national kind of understanding that Aboriginal people, we want to see the impact of the sheer violence that's occurred on our bodies needs to be acknowledged
Yeah.
in multiple ways.
Yeah.
And if it's not acknowledged, then we have to continue to bear that and continue to to let people know we don't forget. We're not going to forget it. But it actually has a physical toll on our body. So if we're talking about health or well-being, if you have to continually educate your oppressors about the representational prison that they've created for you, then it's not a great place to dwell. But we do that because I refuse to let that, I will remember my cousins, my aunties, my uncles, my elders, the people who are coming, the people who are dying in custody continually, the kinds of ways in which we're discounted, misrepresented, all of those things need to be part of our conversations that we're having all the time. They need to be complex.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
Yeah. Which circles us back to this question of commemorating Cook's Landing, and this here is, and also the question of performance, which we engaged with before. But this here is an image of the commemoration of the First Fleet rather than Cook's Landing. And I know, Ali, that you're interested in these kinds of reenactments, and there was planned a something called Encounters Around Australia for this year, which was the replica Endeavour undertaking a series of voyages to 38 destinations around Australia to mark 250 years since Cook's Landing. I presume that coronavirus has put a stop to that.
Gone pretty quiet.
It's gone pretty quiet. It has, yeah. I haven't seen any official statements, but I can't imagine, particularly given the reputation of ships and cruises and things in general in relation to disease at the moment, that they would allow that to happen. But who knows? But this was taken in 1988 during the bicentennial celebrations at the sort of peak of the hoo-ha around it all. But simultaneously, there was a very powerful movement of protest and resistance to all of this. And Ali, you were part of that as a child of probably about 12, is that right? Do you want to say a little bit about why you're interested in this image and the kinds of things that it brings to mind in the context of this year's commemoration?
Yes, well, I think we went to Sydney in 1988 with thousands of other Aboriginal people and I was only 12, and I went in the convoy with my mum and my aunties and my community from Adelaide, and there were as a convoy of Aboriginal people that converged from all parts of what is now understood to be Australia, but coming down from Kimberley, from Central Australia, from Arnhem Land, from all parts of Australia, and we converged and drove in Sydney, and one long line of cars and buses that went for about 10 kilometres.
Extraordinary.
With banners flying and flags, and it was an incredible. And we were listening to the radio, and you could hear the narrative on the radio of like the Aboriginal people are arriving to. You could see people standing at the front of their shops looking very disappointed at the 10 kilometres of Aboriginal people's cars cruising in to interrupt the uninterrupted debauchery that had been. It was interrupted. It's always been interrupted. Our very physical presence interrupts that. So we were staying at La Perouse, but there was obviously when the replica tall ships that had sailed all the way from England sailed into the harbour, and 4 million people lined the harbour to watch as the replica for, you know, fleet sailed in, and Prince Charles and Lady Diana were waving, or Princess Diana were waving from the deck of one of the the ships. It's a particular, like, hyper. It was like the peak of representational, like, craziness. And there's a few documentaries that really demonstrate that really well. But I mean, I think where we were headed this year before COVID, you know, we've just been, we were going to be in the Niran, the Sydney Biennale, Biennale of Sydney, and we'd been across for the National last year, and Faye had seen the spot where they've cleared to build the big Cook statue. You know, we didn't imagine these things. This is actually, this is really how little some people think of Aboriginal people's, you know, there's not a lot to celebrate for us in relation to these images and these sets of ideas. And so, you know, that relationship to power needs to be challenged all the way. And I think, you know, in many ways that Change the Date movement and the kind of, you know, the AB Original song around January 26 and the kind of movements that, you know, have been led by Aboriginal people for a long time, but, you know, particularly the protests that have occurred in Melbourne on Invasion Day / Survival Day / Australia Day really show that we are quite polarised in terms, you know, nationally, in terms of what the narrative is and how do we understand ourselves. And for me, the complexity of it is that you can't deny any of it, but we need to be able to have a conversation where that is kind of where understandings about justice and representation need to be brought into the kind of the conversation. It can't just be, we can't be continually hijacked anymore. And I think that's one of the incredible things about the activism of Aboriginal artists and leaders and communities and the protest movements that this particular one in 1988 was massive. It was over 20,000 people marched through the centre of Sydney because you know, not just Aboriginal people, lots of non-Indigenous peoples who are allies of Aboriginal people have a different perspective on what they want to understand about who we are and where we've come and where we need to go in terms of our national narrative. And so that representational push and pull is where we are located. So we need to be able to have conversations about that. Yeah. To me, that's what's really interesting about history and learning and universities, is that you can have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ali, I think this is our final image for our conversation. Thinking about those conversations that we're having now, you know, looking back on a reenactment that took place in 1938 at the sesquicentenary of the arrival of the First Fleet, you know, you might make the mistake of assuming there weren't these kinds of conversations happening. But do you want to put this image in a bit of context for us around the sort of resistance and coercion that this sort of performance that this image was taken from represents?
So I'd encourage people to look at this clip because it, you know, I don't want to get it wrong. I've watched it a few times, and what it really palpably shows is that, I think about Romaine Morton's work in the Australian Film and Television Archive as well, around the kind of representations of Aboriginal people. She called them our celluloid ancestors, in her beautiful, incredible work, 1 Billion Beats, which was commissioned by the Campbelltown Arts Theatre. But I just think about this kind of forced performance. So Aboriginal people who were forced into performing a symbolic kind of resignation, ceding. Or I think about the incredible, the people who were forced to travel, that Looking for Tambo exhibition, which highlighted the cunning of circus, and people who again were taken from around where Faye was born, and taken on a tour of the Americas and all died, forced to perform this idea of savage. And, so while we can, I might say that we were hysterically laughing, it's the difference between laughing and crying. Like we laugh because we can speak back. But for my grandmother's generation, to speak up would be to actually literally risk your entire life. And for some Aboriginal people, it still is that, for people who die in custody due to kind of institutionalised racism of our, and the kind of the ways in which our children are being removed, the kind of crises in our communities, the poverty, the incarceration levels. These aren't, we need to all be engaged in speaking back to those. And for Aboriginal, we have to speak. We have to speak about it. So for some people, like for my nana, to speak would have been to be, her survival required silence. But it was active, it was a survival. It was a survival that she was trying to engage with. So, and I just think about these fellows who thought they were going to be killed if they didn't do this performance. They were basically ordered to do it. And the kind of the emotional relationship to those representations, needs to be really considered, because this is a really important story. They have to be. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also think it's worth remembering that, when this performance was taking place, it was also the first day of mourning, the public protest by the Aboriginal Progressive Association, on George Street in Sydney, during the celebrations of the sesquicentenary. So there's an attempt, there was a, very profound attempt and powerful attempt to speak back to some of this, that some people were able to participate in, some Aboriginal people, while at the same time these men from Menindee Mission basically were not given any choice, were they? As you say, this was about survival for them.
Yeah. And so, I think about those kind of relationships between this idea of Invasion Day and Survival Day and Australia Day, and in a way they're all, survival, the older that I get and the more that my contemporaries and elders, pass away around me, I think survival is important. Survival is, I want survival.
Yeah.
But I want more than that as well. I want to have our, our relationships with each other and with this country and with the universe and the cosmos. I want the relationships, the unknown. It's beyond comprehension how this stuff is continually rehashed in such ways that I just find totally, they're not creative ways. For me, like a creative response, a transformative response is to be able to acknowledge those histories in really, really vital ways. Sorry, I've got my phone dinging in there.
That's all right. Well, Ali, I think that, your work and the work of the Unbound Collective is a very powerful force for transformation, and may be seen and watched and heard by lots of people in the context, particularly of these commemorations, what Marcia Langton has called this white supremacist orgy of commemorating the anniversary of Cook's Landing. We need voices like yours, and it's such a compelling and powerful voice that I personally, I think many of us are very grateful for the kind of work that you and the Unbound Collective are doing. Thank you so much for speaking to me today about all of this. It's been wonderful.
Thanks, Kath. Yeah, thank you.